Okay, so good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Paula Fernanda, a member of Alliance for Europe, and I would like to welcome you all to the second event of my organization in this club with the theme, Does the EU immigration and refugee policy need a reform, and how can we campaign about it? We will discuss tonight about the refugees and immigration policy and also how to campaign about it from several different perspectives. So from a perspective of the European Parliament as well as political parties, civil societies and active citizens. So in this point, please also allow me to take advantage of this position and make a couple of points. So the first point that I would like to make is a personal one, and the second one is from a political point of view. So I have a personal message from myself, as I am a young migrant from Peru in the European Union. And initially, I came here to the European Union to study my master's degree at Maastricht University. And as a migrant, I can say that I can contribute a lot to the European Union. And I have graduated from my master's degree, so I have obtained a European diploma. And therefore, I have been granted a 1 year extra from Dutch immigration. And I have been considered a high-skilled migrant. And so I consider myself a qualified, committed person to to meet all the European values. And I have selected the European Union instead of North America, which is the place where my fellow Peruvians decide to go, because I do think that Europe meets my personal values and my personal interests, and it's a very intimate place for me. And with this being said, I would like to send a political suggestion before the European elections go on. So I think that it is in Europe's best interest to also be more welcoming for international students. As you know, for one reason, I do think that we have been granted 1 year extra after finishing our diplomas, and because we can become also potential researchers or champions in innovation, and we can do contribute to European society. And many of us regrettably need to leave after a certain time. And for example, if you take into account the US, they have been welcoming international people from the 1950s until now, until very recently. And now they are in a position of being champions of research or innovation and powerful in general. So therefore, something that, in my personal opinion, needs to be changed in European immigration policy is to make Europe more welcoming for also international students as well as for refugees. And so enough said about my personal views, and I would like to pass the floor first to Mr. Yanis Karamitzios, who is one of the founders of Alliance for Europe. The second person who will be giving a speech is Mrs. Colom Cahen Salvador. She's a policy lead and founder of Bold Europe and a candidate for French elections in the European Parliament in the name of Bold. And finally, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Moraes, and he's a member of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom and chair of Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs of the European Parliament. So thank you very much for listening and attending this event tonight.
Thank you, Paula, and also good afternoon, good evening from myself. I'm Yanis Karamitzios. I come from Greece. I live and work in Brussels as EU lawyer for the European Commission, but tonight I will not speak in that capacity. Tonight I will speak as member of Alliance for Europe. I'm co-founder of this organization that was created last October in Munich, in Germany, with the aim to campaign for a European agenda in favor of European values as we see them. Also, in the short term, to campaign for a high participation in the next elections for the European Parliament. So tonight, I will not speak as an EU lawyer, nor as an immigration or refugee expert. I'm not such an expert, but I will speak from the point of view of a campaigner. I would like to share with you some talking points. I gathered 5 talking points that I suggest to you, to ourselves, that we all use when we campaign for Europe, when we speak to ordinary people about Europe, with relation to the immigration and the refugee issue. And I think this is quite important because the issue of immigration and refugees has been really manipulated by the populists, the liberals, the authoritarian regimes and forces all over Europe. And we need to find our voice back about this issue. We need to counter the sometimes racist and xenophobic narrative of all those forces. So what we could offer today out of our small experience is some 5 talking points that if you like them, please pick them up and develop them further yourself. The first point that we would like to make as Alliance for Europe is that first, there is no refugee crisis or immigration crisis. Yes, there was a crisis in 2015, mainly because of the Syrian war, when more than 1.2 million refugees fled into Europe, and they brought a big crisis to the Dublin system of asylum seeking, also to the Schengen system itself. But now the figures have declined. They are less than half. Last year, I think, there were only 580,000 asylum seekers in Europe, and this number is projected to decline further. So what we should talk about, and we should change our political positioning about it, we are talking about a migration phenomenon. Immigration, including refugees seeking for a residence in Europe, is an ages-old phenomenon since the dawn of humanity. We are all immigrants, more or less, and this phenomenon is projected to intensify definitely in the future due to many different reasons: wars, climate change, environmental pressures, overpopulation. We have to deal with this. So let's take best advantage of that. And an additional point is that we might become immigrants ourselves. In the future, Europe is not going necessarily to be the predominant place in the world. We or our descendants might also need to migrate to other continents. So it's an international issue on which we all have to cooperate. And we also need to make clear to the people when we speak to them what is the difference between the refugee and the immigrant. The refugee is a person who fled his or her country because of war and persecution and violence, and is seeking for asylum in Europe under the International Geneva Convention. Has a legal status. There are legal obligations for ourselves to accept them or not. An immigrant, someone like Paula, for instance, who selected Europe to be a place of its residence. And on immigration, we also have to follow a more consistent policy. So this is the first issue. There is no crisis. This is a constant phenomenon we have to cope with. The second talking point we would like to suggest is the fact that immigrants, the number of immigrants in Europe is less than we think. Last year, 30 out of the EU population, of a population of 500 million people, only 38 million people were born outside the EU. And many of them already had EU citizenship. This is less than 8% of the EU population. This is not much. It's like in a big village of 1,000 people, only 80 being immigrants. And according to a Eurobarometer study, it's attached to the leaflets that we distributed to you. You can have a quieter look later on. According to that study, in most of member states, people believe that the number of immigrants in their country is double or more than the real number. So there is a perception based on misinformation and based on distortion of facts, that we are flooded by immigrants or refugees in our territory, in our population. This is wrong. So if you bother to further talk about Europe and immigration to your fellow citizens, please highlight this fact. Third talking point that we would like to suggest is that any refugee or immigration policy should be a European policy. Maybe Mr. Moraes will explain better later on, or Colomb, that the Dublin system is not European enough yet. Dublin system is basically the rule that the first country, the first member state that receives an asylum seeker takes the full responsibility to take care of this application. For this reason, we have a disproportionate burden on countries which are geographically closer to the areas of crisis, like Greece or Italy. They have received a lot of people. A lot of people were stuck there because they could not move further to Europe. And then we had this political crisis of 2015. We got divided. Italians, Greeks had complaints against North Europe for not being solidary enough. Hungarians and others closed the borders because they didn't want to take over the refugees who were not properly controlled on the Greek borders, for instance, so they accused Greece or Italy. And then we had also the internal divisions throughout the EU. All that situation could have been avoided if we had a truly European asylum policy from the very beginning, sharing the burden and sharing the opportunities for this situation. Refugees apart, also we could also have a more European policy on regular immigration. Right now there are in the EU common rules, some basic harmonized rules about how to receive an immigrant, how to register an immigrant, but member states still have the possibility to determine the number of immigrants to be admitted in their territories. So we are wondering, what if we establish also more harmonized European rules also on regular immigration, where we can establish European quotas. For instance, there is an estimation that every year 2 million new immigrants arrive to the EU. Of course, we can agree all together that this number is maintained, even increased. I believe personally it should be increased. We need new people in Europe. We are still an empty continent in many aspects. And if we made a better sharing of resources in order to accept and accommodate those people, to adopt more harmonized rule on how to grant their citizenship, for instance, after certain years, meaning sharing both the burden and the opportunity of their presence. This is something that we need. The fourth talking point is that, contrary to what the illiberal and populists claim, we are not in favor of unlimited, uncontrolled immigration. We are not in favor of letting everybody in and being flooded by millions of people, many more people every year. No, we believe it's also in the interest of the immigrants themselves, or the refugees, that immigration is legal, it's controlled, it's sustainable, it's predictable. We would support, we suggest that you also support a better border policy, a more proactive approach where we support the countries, the neighboring countries that produce, let's say, generate immigration or which host immigrants, that they accommodate them under more humane conditions. When immigrants are found, where people are found in the EU and they are not refugees anymore, they don't have a refugee status, nor they are legally present in the EU, they should be treated in the most humane way. They should be helped to be repatriated or relocated, even with the proper provisional documentation, financial support, but we should have a firm policy. In any case, there are not many. Last year, I think, only 600,000 illegal immigrants were found in the EU, and those people, frankly speaking, do not introduce a big burden to our continent. It's a matter of political will to grant them the proper documentation, the proper assistance to make their life choices for the future. Fifth and last talking point is that immigration or refugee reception in any case has to be humane. Why? First, because this is a principal European value, humane treatment of every human being. It's a classic European ethics, but ethics apart, it's also in our self-interest. We want the newcomers who are in Europe to be well-fed, well-educated, in good health, to feel accommodated and well-employed, to have good prospects in their life. This is the best way for them to be integrated, to stay away from criminality, to stay away from radicalization. In this respect, yes, we will need more resources to offer them to make their paper admission and one-stop procedure, to increase the technologies linked to the registration and reception of immigrants, to create better networks for them to find employment. We can use cloud computing algorithms where employers can find within the immigrants, the new arrivals, the ideal or the appropriate employees. Of course, it's easy to say all this, it's difficult to implement, I know. Sometimes we don't have such structures even for the local European people. On the other hand, sometimes it's not a matter of resources. Sometimes it's a matter of political will. Once we get the political will to have a more organized reception of the immigrants, to organize better even the technology to receive them, things will become much smoother for everybody. A lot of angry voices will be diluted. A lot of populist forces will become weaker. So this is the conclusion. To sum up, again, the 5 talking points is first, there is no migration crisis. Second, immigrants, refugees are less than we think. Third, we need a European refugee and immigration approach. Fourth, we are not in favor of uncontrolled immigration. Fifth, immigration must be humane. If you find those talking points useful for your own discussion groups, your organizations, your political parties, when you contact people, when you yourself campaign about Europe, you are welcome to use them and even develop them further according to your own views. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your speech. I actually have one important question with regards to your fifth point. So you have talked about more humane laws, immigration policies. So would that be including, for example, convincing employers that working permits for newcomers or immigrants could not be sometimes as complicated as they mostly think all the time?
Sometimes it's not only the employers, it's the state itself, it's the legal framework which is in place itself that makes recruitment of an immigrant, of someone with a temporary residence, almost impossible. So as a result, they end up, I think in most of the cases, to be employed under the black market. No insurance, no taxation, nothing. I think that if a framework, first of all, supports the employers themselves to proceed with such kind of recruitments, if some subsidies are available, if the regime is less punitive to the employers or the employees, and of course, if the right infrastructure is in place, then a lot of forces, productive forces from both sides, the employers and the refugee immigrant employees, will be released. And this will be in a tremendous benefit for the entire society.
Thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Karamitzios. So now I would like to pass the floor to Mrs. Colomb. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Colomb. I'm the co-founder of Volt Europa, which is a political party. I actually used to work in human rights and more specifically in refugee rights, so I'm super happy to be here tonight. how I propose to go about this is, if it's okay with you, I'll give you a super short intro on what Volt is to put into context, because even though I really hope that all of you already know about Volt, I'm not sure it's the case. Second, I can describe quickly our policies, but because I understand that this is more of a campaigning event as well than a purely policy event, I'm happy to explain as well how we try to answer to questions about refugees and migrants on our campaign trails. So Volt is a pan-European political party. We are now present in 32 European countries. We actually created Volt as a result of Brexit. So it sounds a bit like the beginning of a joke, but Volt was created by a French, a German, and an Italian. We all realized on the day of Brexit that we had no political party that actually fully represented us as Europeans and that was capable of answering European questions. So I think migration is a perfect theme when we look at it. Migration is not a problem, but it's a European concern that we need to be able to deal with together, because we have clearly seen that individual responses don't work. So for me, it's a good way to illustrate why we needed Volt in the first instance, an actual European political party that could deal in a European manner with European political questions. So we are campaigning for the European elections, and in this sense, it's also why I'm here, in at least 7 countries on a common program, a part of which represents and concerns migration. And we intend on the long term to form an independent group in the European Parliament. Concerning our refugee and migration policies, and then I would actually love to address some of your very interesting points. We consider migration, and I think it's a big issue often when we talk about migration, to be kind of a burden on European states. We consider it to be an opportunity for many of us. And I believe that when we campaign, it's also very important to explain how this is not only a moral, historical, and legal duty to accept refugees and that we should accept migrants in Europe, but that it actually represents an opportunity for us, and it's also a reason for which we should do it. So on asylum seekers and refugees, we want a European system. So we want to reform Dublin, obviously, as it's not working, but we want to have a common asylum system with quotas that are determined based on, of course, preferences of the people themselves, but also, GDP, the population of the country, and the capacity of the country to welcome people. So we have seen, and we're not completely idealist, we have seen that countries have tried to introduce such a system and that it doesn't necessarily work. We hope that by bringing a European political party, where we already all agree between 32 countries that this is needed, we go beyond the European Union. Between 32 countries that this is needed, and by, on the long term, having a European group, we'll be able to push for those policies in a more effective manner. We also see that even when you have European regulations and directives, they're not always very respected, especially when we talk about migration and refugee rights, which is why we want to have a strong point and make sure that states that don't uphold their obligations would be sanctioned. So less European funds for certain topics if you don't actually respect your European obligations. We also want, so regarding some of the points you mentioned, we of course want to make sure that we have more fair rules throughout the EU when we actually accept people, so whether we're talking about accommodations or legal procedures that take too long. But not only, talking about opportunities. In many of our countries, refugees and asylum seekers can't actually work before they get refugee status, and even when they get the status, they have restrictions. People that work are a benefit to the economy. People that don't work can be a burden to the state. It's pretty simple when you explain it, right? So I studied law in the UK, and while I was studying, I was working at Coventry Law Centre, which processes asylum claims in the UK. Many of the families that we actually tried to help, even though it was during a period where Cameron cut 70% of legal aids, which didn't make it very, very easy, but many of the families that we tried to help lived on a couple hundreds pounds per month, which makes it extremely complicated, and they couldn't work. If you give them the possibility to work, they will try to find a job and will be able to contribute to the local economy. So this, for me, because we're talking about campaigning, is a way also to explain the benefits of actually giving fair treatment, apart from the fact that we need to people coming to Europe. Then you mentioned highly skilled migrants that should be able to find a job in an easier manner and be given more opportunities in Europe. I agree with it. Again, migration can be an opportunity for our countries. We have seen it in the US. We have seen it in other countries. It's why we want to make it easier for highly skilled migrants to go through the administrative procedures. So, of course, it requires also changing national laws to make sure that they can actually stay, contribute to our societies, and have the lives they wish for. I'm happy to go more into details if you have questions, but I don't want to bore you with our many, many, many pages of policies. So I think I'll address your points, if that's okay, very quickly. In general, I agree with most of your points, but I think I would put a few details in it. So the first point, I completely agree that there's never been, and it's not a migration crisis. But I don't agree that in 2015 it was a migration crisis. In 2015, during the 9 worst months of those migration flows, arrivals represented 0.3% of the European population. This is not a crisis. What's a crisis is the way we dealt with it. The fact that we let people die in the sea. The fact that we let Italy, Greece, now Spain, deal with arrivals on their own without doing it as a union, like we should supposed to be doing it, and without actually showing empathy, sympathy, and enabling people to, spread throughout Europe. For me, this is completely a political crisis, and it's our failures, and it's never been a migration crisis. We've never been overwhelmed, our system has been, and we haven't been able to cope. The numbers haven't threatened our continent or our countries. It's never done this. Second, you mentioned European policies and making, I think it was your third point, if I'm not getting it wrong, for the fact that we don't want to just accept everyone. I agree, we can't take everyone into Europe, and I think not everyone wants to come to Europe in the first place. I would just add a little point on the fact that when people don't qualify for refugee status or for a visa, they should be sent back. We need to make sure that this is done in a humane manner, respecting international law, and that they can't be sent back to a country where they actually face persecutions or where there would be a threat to their lives. And I actually really appreciated the point that you said that we need to help neighboring countries. So, and I spoke to a few of you before that came from different countries to Europe. If we consider that 86% of refugees live in developing countries, and that they don't necessarily try to come to Europe, we clearly see that the myth of populists and extremists of saying, everyone wants to come and invade our continent, this is horrible, we need to close our borders, doesn't work. People want to stay next to their homes most of the time, where they hope they will be able to go back home eventually, especially, I'm talking about refugees, not migrants, but especially when, some part of their families, homes, loved ones are still at home. And this is when we actually need to help neighboring countries cope with it. So if we look at Jordan, Jordan had an incredible amount of refugees that came in. And I do believe personally that for a while they still do try to cope with it in a fair manner. But we can't ask a country, just like we can't ask Italy, Spain, and Greece to take on everyone. We need to make sure that we give the financial contributions so that infrastructures can be built, so that refugees can be hosted, that they have the right to work and integrate, and that they don't have to take a very risky journey to come to Europe in the first place. For the rest of the points, I agree with pretty much everything, so I'm really happy about them. And I thought that I would actually leave you, because I think the discussion is very negative most of the time when we talk about migrations and refugees, when again, we try to turn it into opportunities when we talk about to people and explaining how this could help and contribute to their lives. But I saw a study 3 days ago that went out that was positive for the first time in a very long time. So the Pew, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, the Pew Research Center, PUW, it's like this, yeah. Released a survey where they looked at, I think, at the 15 biggest countries that actually receive migrants, so proportionally. And in more than half of those countries, the national population thought that migration was a benefit to their countries rather than a burden on the country. And it's the first time in a very long time, so obviously I'm sure that survey is contradicting this, but it's the first time in a very long time that this has happened. So I think that we also begin to see a shift in mentalities, and it was the case in my home country, France, where more than 56% of the population thought that refugees represented an opportunity, which I think is really good news, especially when I see that my government closed our borders in July 2017. It shows a shift in borders, in mentalities.
Well, I have to say I have been really impressed by the additional points that you have brought to the speech so far, especially because I have also written my master's thesis on refugees and especially Syrian refugees, so thank you very much. I have learned a lot. So now I would like to pass the floor to Mr. Moraes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very impressed by Colombe and Yanis as well. I'm not sure why I'm here, really. I'm not campaigning for anything, not personally anyway. And I'm not in campaign mode, so I might not sound quite as fresh and kind of punchy as you did sound just now. This is what happens when you're campaigning. You kind of get it all together. And I really need to kind of up my game here, because I was going to talk about all the problems with European Union migration policy, of which there are many. But let me try and shift my mindset to something a bit more positive, if I can bear it. Um, um, there are a lot of problems with European Union migration policy. Migration, well, this is an old story. I mean, everything Yanis said is, I really admire the positive thrust of how you put things, because with migration and European Union migration policy, it's relentlessly being fed through a populist narrative, and these people are grabbing the agenda, the narrative, and they're really killing us. And of course, this is what's happening. Every sensible person knows that. It's an age-old story, and it's been refreshed in many countries in the European Union, so we're all aware of this. I think maybe if I just comment on a couple of things for information in a non-campaigning style. First of all, I think it's admirable if we campaign in a positive and brave way, because I think what the populists are doing now, what Salvini is dependent on, is for progressives and people who think more clearly about migration to run and to be afraid of this kind of relentless rhetoric. I mean, they depend on it. They're succeeding to the most extent. And they succeed because it's very difficult to argue the counter case. So, for example, this Pew research that you quoted, there's been relentless amounts of research. There was some research recently in Germany about the contribution of Syrian asylum seekers. People like you, Alessandro, people like my family have all contributed net benefits to the European Union, but people don't care because they're racist. Racism is the key here. Sorry to be so blunt. It's the other, it's people who are black, people who are South Asian, people who are maybe Latin American. If we were white, it would not be a problem, because complete assimilation would have now taken place. Do you understand? This is the problem. 6 people every day in 2018 died in the Mediterranean. These are official media type figures. It's far more than this. I visited Niger recently, and far more people die in Niger and Agadez and in the smuggling routes than ever die in the Mediterranean. There is a migration crisis. It's a global migration crisis, not a European migration crisis. And the crisis is one which is one that we can calibrate. It affects European Union in particular ways. The European Union reacts to it in particular ways. First of all, it's led by member states. The European Union, in essence, doesn't really control much of the policy. Where it does, it makes many mistakes. It does some good things, but mainly at the moment it's making many, many mistakes. If you look at the Western Mediterranean, the routes to Spain, if you're looking at what's happening with Libya in particular, if you look at the chaos currently, and I measured chaos with what is still happening with Italy, and but particularly with Greece and Moria and so on, which is very bad, by the way, because we need to deal with that, and we shouldn't be having those conditions still in the European Union. Having said that, a lot of good work, as Yanis knows, is still happening in the European Union. A lot of good people doing a lot of good work, evacuations and all the rest of it. However, there is a real problem at the heart of everything. And that problem is driven by member states. Member states are driven on migration and immigration policy, and there are two different things, migration policy and asylum policy. And they're driven by what their electorates are telling them and what they fear. And fear is even more important than the electoral indicators. Fear is a special ingredient in migration policy, and this is why when Colomb spoke positively and combatively on this issue, that is very important, because populists smell fear, sense fear, and they get votes on the back of fear. And very often they don't contextualize migration at all. So if I give you a couple of examples, one from migration and one from asylum. On migration, Alessandro talked about the difficulties that people from outside the European Union find in a European Union which actually needs migrants. So the European Union needs migrants. There are many parts of the European Union, many areas in which we need demographically migrants, as Yanis said. So here we have this issue. Obviously, we need some migrants. And yet, member states don't want to have a European Union legal migration policy. They can't agree even on a blue card. Now, blue card is really, honestly, the most whitest probably immigration policy you can have. High skills, member states are in control. Only one country used the original blue card, really, Germany. Most other countries didn't bother using it. Sweden's got a better version. So really, they can't even agree on a revision of a blue card. The only other elements of legal migration policy that exist in the European Union are students and researchers. It's a good file. It's not going to reach very far. And seasonal workers, born of the terrible conditions that migrant workers faced in southern Italy. So here you have piecemeal approach, and the member states will do everything possible to suppress and destroy what exists of European Union migration legal policy. Commission were very progressive on this, and many progressive people tried to create one. Why? Because in addition to what member states do on migration, it's self-evident that there needs to be some kind of cross-border attempt to have some legal migration policy. Some countries would never be part of it, United Kingdom being a prime example, never want to be part of something like that. Of course, now leaving, but would never want to be part of it, never want to be part of Schengen, but some countries would want to be part of it. And we're in a global economy, we're in an economy where everyone is moving. So of course it makes sense to big countries to have some kind of credible, open and non-slave-like movement, meaning if you're from India, you're not going to look at the European Union as a guest worker environment. You're looking at it as something that regards you, your labour, your family unity with some dignity. So some kind of policy that the European Union adopts that sees other people with dignity and not as some kind of guest workers. That was the point. So where is the blue card revision today? It's not going to happen. That's where it is. So we have a real crisis, and it's the same for young people who are coming from outside, and yet we have a need for migration. And why is this happening? Because before a European election, nobody wants to touch anything that's got migration labelled on it. So yes, we have to be very bold and say, what is it we need? Member states will always control legal migration in the main. It will never be a completely European Union policy. Does it need to be? I don't see why it needs to be. But those elements that we do need are quite precious. It's a really interesting global environment we now have, and people will ask why the European Union doesn't have such a policy. When it comes to asylum, we have an asylum package which two weeks ago was entirely, I would say destroyed, but frozen is the word apparently politely I'm supposed to use, frozen by the council, meaning chucked in the bin. That's Dublin, qualifications, reception conditions. Of course we'll get something called Eurodac, which is about fingerprinting because that sounds like security, and the Asylum Support Office because, that might be practically useful. But everything fundamental and profound that people worked on for months and months in the European Parliament with the Commission, with goodwill, to replace all the temporary measures in the Mediterranean, measures which are compromising the member states because many of them support the Libyan Coast Guard. Some of the worst measures that we now see in the Mediterranean are really not good enough. They are not, people in this room, years from now, when they look back and people say, what did you do when all these people were dying in the Mediterranean and criminalising NGOs that were trying to do good things? We will have to answer that question. When we try and answer that question, we will be asked what it is we were doing with the Libyan Coast Guard. And of course, the truth will come out. And that is not a good position to be in. Now, I don't believe the Commission got us into that. I think member states are getting us into that situation. And they are driven now by, not by populism, but by electorates who are looking for the easy answer. The easy answer is migration and migrants. Now, it's really interesting that some of these countries don't have many migrants. Hungary doesn't have many migrants or immigrants. Poland, I know because I was there recently, Hungary, there recently, you know, they don't have many migrants, but they send the fear of God into their electorates about, guess, migrants, the fear of migration. What is the fear of migration in Poland today? I really don't want to guess what that is, but there is a lot of fear about the other. And the issue is that these are economically growing countries who are stigmatizing a particular fear or creating a particular fear. And this is going to be a pivotal issue for the European Union. It's a make or break issue for the European Union, migration. This is not like other issues. It is the key issue of the populace. Anyone who understands what right-wing or far-right discourse is today, the Great Replacement, all of the kind of phraseology that's being used, must understand what the big narrative is today. It is not demographically, do we need migrants? Do we need Alessandro? Do we need my children or me or anyone else from outside the European Union? The great narrative is, what kind of people are we trying to stop coming to the European Union? People who are not white, and how do we stop them? That is what the great narrative is. And that's a disgraceful narrative. So how do we reverse it? How do we try and create some sanity into the debate? The first thing is to understand that there needs to be some migration. There will be migration to the European Union. Once we accept that there will be migration, then we need to know what the parameters of that are. And I think here we can be realistic, we can be comprehensive, we can be holistic, but it does require an entire generation to stand up and to actually be honest. And, you know, as I've heard today from Colom, I've heard it from Yanis, it's not easy to do it. People will laugh. People will say, you know, yeah, but that's not realistic to say it. Well, you know, how did me and my parents end up here? By the way, I was born in Yemen, a country where Britain was committing a semi-genocide, kicked out of that country, back to India, from India back to United Kingdom, friendly country, Scotland, kicked out of there, went back. You know, you have to understand exactly what you're dealing with here. It depends on your experience to understand what the immigrant and migrant experience really is. Difference is the key, race is the key, and racism is the key. And if we deny this and don't understand it, then we don't understand what is going on. And as I say, years from now, particularly younger people here, I mean, I discount the older people. This story is really gone on for a long time. But for younger people, focus on this. 6 people a day are dying. It was going to be a lot more. And just think about if those 6 people a day were white. Think about it for a moment. If 6 people a day were dying, drowning, children, every single day, and they were white, think about it. But they're not white, they're African. So of course the media has disappeared. And if it's 20 or 30 people in the Agadez route and they were dying and they were white, think about it for a moment. Just think about that for a moment. Maybe I'm being a bit dramatic, but I think it's true. So this is the real truth of migration policy. We have a demographic need for migration. Asylum, as I think maybe Colom said, is not the biggest issue for Europe. It's the biggest issue for Africa. You see huge refugee camps in Africa and the Middle East. I was in Lebanon recently. The country is crippled by refugee camps. I mean, I was born in Yemen. We used to travel around the Middle East when I was young. It was a country without refugees, without pressure in that sense. Today, it is just flooded with refugees. But all we can talk about in the European Union is our burden of refugees. And let me be realistic. It's true because it's a relative issue. So for those of you who are thinking, God, he's just gone on about how easy it all is. It's not easy because it's relative. Europe is special. The European Union is special. Why are we special? Not me, we particularly, because I don't feel truly European. I'll never be accepted as truly European. I'm of Indian origin. So why is Europe special? What's the exceptionalism? The European Union is white mainly. And that's what the exceptionalism is. Unfortunately, that is true, because the European Union is not developed like the United States. It's not seen as a country of migration. Okay, maybe in the age of Trump, one can't make that kind of assumption too easily. But let's be very clear. When you have a refugee crisis that affects Germany the way it does, of course, that is a relative issue. It's an extremely difficult issue. And the migration crisis that affected the European Union was quite significant because it's a relative issue. The same numbers in Africa, the same numbers in the Middle East, of course, were not as dramatic. But for the European Union, they were dramatic because they were new, they were different, and they created a relative problem. So we have to see the world as it is, and we have to deal with what happened in the European Union. And we're still dealing with it. So in Moria and Lesbos and in Greece, we're still dealing with a very bad situation where some refugees are in worse conditions than they are, by the way, in Africa. That is something that we need to think about. So all of these things have to be challenged. And meanwhile, in the middle of all of this, Salvini is talking about the great burden on all of us. In some ways, of course, he's pointing to something quite realistic, which is that in all of this and underneath all of these layers, the European Union did not pursue solidarity. So the populists and the fascists and the far right have a very easy target because solidarity was not pursued. So all these people can crawl out of their caves and they can come in and say, well, the European Union didn't pursue solidarity. Italy has its burden. You know, other countries have their burden, and the right is on the march because we didn't pursue solidarity. Dublin was about responsibility sharing, but we didn't do it. So the European Union will be made or will be broken on whether we can have responsibility sharing, whether we understand that that is what will, in the end, allow the European Union to proceed. This, I suppose, and the rule of law. If we don't grasp these two nettles, then of course I think the European Union will start to break apart because these are going to be the critical issues of the next few years. The next European Parliament will be more right-wing. It will be more fixated on migration, more fixated on the rule of law. And the fear is not that far-right parties will rule. The fear is that far-right parties will destabilise centre parties. That, of course, is the fear of the EPP today. That's what they're fearing of Orban. That's what they're fearing about migration. That's what happened to the Social Democrats. And you'll see that instability in the next European Parliament. At the core of it will be migration and the rule of law, which is why both migration and the rule of law are the critical issues. It's why my committee is completely dominated by those issues. And when they're not dominated by those issues, they're dominated by issues which are related. You see the terrible terrorist attack. People look at what this evil guy said, and you see what he said. And I just end on this. He's evil, but what he talked about was the great replacement. And I kid you not, this semi-literate evil terrorist, what was his first point that he made in his terrible video killing all of these innocent, decent people in New Zealand? His biggest worry, what was his biggest worry? Did you know what his, I mean, I guess you're all in a good place if you didn't want to read it. I didn't read it, but I happened to see one of the news outlets explaining it. His biggest concern that led him to do this was the UN Global Compact on Migration. This was the big evil that he was attacking. Now, I want you to dwell on that for a moment. That was the UN Global Compact on Migration, the big evil. This was the voluntary UN Global Compact on Migration. This is the big target of the far right and the fascists at the moment. And this is a real worry because really it's a signal that doing what Yanis and Colom talked about, being cooperative, dealing with migration in a cooperative, decent way, the UN Global Compact was an example, is now the target of these people. And they think that this is the iconic threat to them. And I think that is a real issue. So don't underestimate migration. Don't underestimate the rule of law. It's going to be the issues for the coming years. And yes, I think I was really quite inspired by how you know, I just wondered how you're campaigning. It's migration. And I wondered how you would do it. And there were your talking points. Migration's a good thing. So all power to you, and keep doing it. I was never quite as brave campaigning in the UK. You mentioned migration, people chuck things at you. You know, you're a migrant and people throw things at you. I grew up with that. I can be free and say these things now I'm old enough. It's just a shit show doing migration. So good for you, and keep doing that. I hope you get some votes, by the way. You know, I mean, people are scared of migration, but try and come out the other side. What Salvini, I watched Salvini at the JHA Council. You know, my estimation of this guy is he's an actor. He knows exactly what he's doing. But the day that he sees enough people saying, look, you're lying, you're just striking fear into our hearts, it's not true. It really isn't true. It's true Italy got a bad deal. There was no solidarity, but you're exploiting us. The day that happens, he's gone, but that day hasn't come yet. So I hope you succeed.
Well, I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Moraes, for your very inspiring speech, I have to say.
Stream of consciousness, sorry. I'm in that sort of mood. I've had a shit day. I'm sorry about that. And also the blue card was cancelled today. So was a lot of other things. So like if there's any journalists in the room, like from The Economist, for example, just give me a break.
But yes, from the bottom of my heart, I have to say thank you very much for all the points that you have addressed. I mean, not only from the side of immigrants in general, but also from the refugee side, because I have also directly dealt with refugees and asylum seekers. And I do agree with most of your points, and especially when you mentioned about the people dying in the boats, for example, because I do personally know people who I had the opportunity to talk to, and you know, they just gave me different stories of why they were escaping Syria or Iraq or Palestinians, for example. So it is very much of a crisis. I have to agree. Also, it's a political crisis. And it's not only European, because in South America, it is also happening the same issue right now with Venezuelan migration to many South American countries, and within South America we are not still able to agree in a policy, in a common ideology, and actually I would like to make a point that in South America many political parties are looking up to Europe, and Europe is still also trying to work out in a policy reform. But I would, on the other note, I would like to ask you one question. So you have talked about racism and fear in, for example, in Poland, and I do agree. I have been to Poland about 4 years ago, and I was quite surprised that I did not see any people wishing to seek asylum in Poland. But on that note, I would like to ask, how do you think that we can combat racism, and should, for example, European countries criminalize people committing racist attacks towards refugees or asylum seekers, or perhaps should European countries establish programs to educate the society to have less fear of immigrants?
I'll be very honest about this. I think you have to give some countries, I mean, the post-Stalinist 2004 accession countries didn't have diverse societies for a reason. France has many different races, backgrounds for a reason. Italy for a reason. They're all post-colonial countries. They all had empires. They all went over and exploited lots of countries. That's why we're all here. That's why I was in the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom had an empire and exploited lots of non-white countries. That's what France did. That's what Belgium did. That's what the Netherlands did. Poland did not do that. Poland was behind the Iron Curtain and didn't do that. Neither did Bulgaria, Romania, and so on, the Baltics. So, of course, I think in looking at the kind of understanding of racism, diversity, you have to understand what is happening in Western Europe, Central Europe, Visegrad countries, and you have to really understand, what that means, what the differences are. And here, policy should be made intelligently. If I give you that example, if you just say, I've been to many of the Baltic countries, talked to them about this idea of solidarity, resettlement, and all of these things. It's not immediately obvious that you just say to people, right, on the Dublin system, a Baltic country takes this many, and then that's it. Not least because if you are displaced and you are a refugee, or you are coming from a particular background, you too are a human being. Okay, Latvia, I'm not saying Latvia, there's nothing wrong with Latvia. I like Latvia. Okay, just before you say if anyone's here from Latvia, I always mention a country, and then the person in the front row is from Latvia. Okay, Estonia. Okay, I love Estonia, by the way. I really like Estonia. If anyone's from Estonia, no disrespect, but look, if you're coming from, if you're a refugee from a particular country and somebody just says, right, we don't care, we think you're just like a refugee, you're going to Estonia under the new Dublin system that Yanis and I are going to put together, because there isn't one at the moment. And, a year from now, well, that's all very well, but it kind of might not make sense. But other things may make sense. For example, solidarity might mean people putting money into the budget, people getting used to resettlement. Those countries might want to resettle refugees. We have a terrible policy on resettlement. We're not resettling anyone. Trump's resettling more people than we are at the moment, as far as I know. Trump, get that into your heads. Donald Trump is resettling more refugees than we are in the European Union. Okay, I'll say that to myself a few times tonight and then get angry about it, and then I might join Volt or whatever it is. No, I won't. I'm not. I'll get expelled from the Labour Party. I'm in the Labour Party. There's rules about those things. So do you know what I mean? It's like you just have to be intelligent about that. We have a race equality directive. I was involved in that. Many countries have just not implemented it because there's just notions of how you tackle discrimination in race. France is a very different concept from the UK. Germany is a different concept. The issue is people just have to do something. They have to, within their legal systems, ensure they're doing the right thing. It's not enough just to say people will not suffer racism. In Poland, when I went to Poland, I met many lawyers and community organisations that are doing the right thing. There are lots of great people in Poland. You pick a country and just slag it off. People are the same everywhere, but circumstances are different. And those people in Poland are fighting a system at the moment. Sorry, no disrespect to anyone who's in the Polish the Law Party. See, I'll say that, and somebody in the front rows in the Poland Law and Justice Party or something. I hope you're not. I wouldn't want to be here if you are. So, no, not you. You're fine. You just were looking at me. Sorry. Stop looking. But do you know what I mean? It's like that. There are good people everywhere, but they're fighting different discriminations. At the moment, they're engaged in fighting, judges being kicked out of their offices. Well, somebody in France is fighting for people who are suffering race discrimination, but the state thinks that in France everyone's the same because they've got a good Republican notion. So they haven't got decent tribunals to do race discrimination cases. But in Britain, they do that, but then they're getting everything else wrong, like we're Brexiting and we've got the worst press in the world, fine, we have lots of other issues. Sorry, that's just my personal bugbear. But, every country has got something going on. The issue is the European Union at least gave us some directions for some good, values to share and to get minimum standards. And I don't think that was ever understood in my country, for example. I'll give you an example, because when they talked about employment and anti-discrimination, last word, sorry, they said that if a right-wing government ever came in, our Prime Minister said this in the United Kingdom, the problem would be that we would have lower employment standards. Now, anyone here from the institutions knows about law? Guess what the thing that's wrong about that? No, that's just wrong, because it's minimum standards that we brought in. That was a great thing about the European Union. I worked on the Working Time Directive, I worked on the Agency Workers Directive, and the Anti-Discrimination Directives, race equality, and sadly we didn't get the Horizontal Directive, which is LGBT and other equalities. The issue is minimum standards for the whole of an entire continent. That's such an amazing thing. Where else are you going to get that? Do you know what I mean? In America, they could pull that back the minute you get some nasty Supreme Court addition. Do you see what I mean? But in the European Union, we had all of these valuable things. And it's hard for people in my country to understand that. But certainly these are the valuable things you should see about the EU. But the EU is not something that is going to do that unless we are behind it, pushing it to sustain that level of goodness, if you see what I mean. You know, it's a living, breathing thing. So yeah, the Race Equality Directive just won't exist unless people make it happen and implement it. I think there's about 6 countries that don't do it. Commission's been great. You've fined everyone that's not doing it. Well done.
So we can now pass the floor to extra questions, but thank you very much for your answer, Mr. Moraes. So I would like to first pass the floor to Emma.
Hello, thank you very much for all of you. It was brilliant, all of you. I would like to ask to all of you a question, Mr. Moraes and perhaps Mrs. Cahen, sorry. How to combine in May, at the end of May, how to combine the 2 different sides of the coin, one side with the European values and the high standard for human beings, we hope European values are, or the need to build a new kind of Dublin 4 sometimes, you know, and on the other side of this coin, the member states who and their fears. One, their fear for their own election because they want to be re-elected, and the fear of their own citizen, real or not real. But we all know that, as a French, for example, I know that hatred and fears are very, very important now in France, even if it's not reasonable and it's not reality. But how to combine that and to try to do good in May, or to help, or to, yes, to push people to vote and to vote for human beings and not because they're pushed by fears and hatred.
So maybe Mr. Moraes can answer the question. Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I think just by being here, we kind of answering the question in the first place. You're talking about fear, and indeed there's a lot of fear, and I think, you know, it was discussed today. When you look at it, I think it's 6 EU member states that reinstated border controls within the EU. France being one of them. I'm French as well, so, you know. But we're talking about elections. So how to change this? By participating in elections in the first place. So I know that Alliance is working on pushing people to vote in the first place, which is great, but I think we also need to get active in politics. So then I'm doing my own propaganda because I'm part of Votes, but the reasons for which we created this is because there's no choice. As you said, we're risking to have a more right-wing parliament that will, you know, I'm hoping it's not going to be the case, but we're seeing more and more people that keep on dying in the Mediterranean. You said it's 6 per day. I mean, there's no words for this. So what can we do? We can protest it and we can try to change it. And I think this is exactly what we need to do for these elections. There's fear, but there's also people that are willing to speak up. And there's also facts that show us that migration can be a benefit. We're talking about Italy and Salvini. Apart from calling him a liar, we have lots of examples that show that migration helps. So I actually took a note before coming here because I thought that this might come up, of a village in Italy that benefited highly from migration. And it's the case of many villages in France and other countries. The name is Riace, I'm probably pronouncing it very badly, where there were, 2,500 inhabitants. That in the 90s it declined. There were 400 people left, no school, supermarkets were closing. Migrants arrived, at first 400 other migrants, we're about at 2,500 people, a school opened, the local economy is growing again. I'm mentioning this example because it's the first one that came up in the Google search and I was looking for the exact names, but there's, sorry? Yeah, but there's, I mean, just after I saw Sutera, and there's lots of French villages that show the same. So there's the lies, but there's also the hopeful examples that show us that if we do this together in a fair manner, you know, allocating people where it makes sense, not only resettling them, but of course considering cultural preferences, family ties, and so on, we can actually make this an opportunity. So there's fear, there's facts, and I think it's just about getting involved and making sure that we try our best. You know, especially as you mentioned, our generation, I won't be able to look at myself in the face if in 50 years, I mean, we're talking about migration, but it's the case with many other issues, right? Climate change, fiscal justice, and so on. If in many years I have to tell people my age now, look, I'm sorry, I was a bit too busy, so, you know, I didn't really take care of the issues, now it's too late, the planet is destroying itself, we made the same mistakes than in the Second World War, keep on returning boats away, like we did, like the US did with St. Louis, and, you know, lots of people died, my bad. So I think it's literally about getting involved and making sure we're trying to change the tide and we're doing our best so that we don't go the wrong directions, that we give hope about migration and that we show that those are real people, real human beings, and that we need concrete solutions.
If I may make a comment from the campaigner's point of view, realistically speaking, there is a portion of population that does not care at all about the messages that we are discussing today. Colomb might argue with figures that migration can help local economy. Some people, even of the local villages, might say, we don't care about economy, we care about our identity, pride, whatever. Let the money go. Some people really have deaf ears, deaf tone to our message. So, personally speaking, I would give up on them. I will not invest too much of effort to diminish their fear. Some things, some instincts are so deeply rooted, sorry for this pessimism, that I would prefer to allocate our resources to the people who are ready to receive the message. In Alliance for Europe, we have identified a kind of group of people that we call the passive positives, meaning people who are in between. They have been silent so far, but they have progressive instincts. This is what Colomb, in a private discussion before, also indicated to me as the progressive gap. And I think this is the people where we should try to find. These are the people who could indeed accept the arguments that we all four presented here about progress, about ethics, because those people do care about ethics, not only about the contribution of immigrants to our society. And from a campaigning point of view, I mean ordinary campaigning, civic campaigning, I think this is the big challenge for us, to identify those group of people. There are millions out there who just need to find the voice in favor of immigration, which at the end of the day is not a matter of immigration, it's a matter of human values. And help them join this battle in the elections, but also outside the election cycle, in civic activities, in daily events like solidarity, employment, education, and so on.
Thank you very much for your answers. Now I would like to pass.
Can I just bounce back on one thing?
Okay, yes.
I agree that, you know, it's a campaign, we're realistic, we need to focus on certain people, we can't do everything, and this is why I mentioned the progressive gap. We did an analysis within votes of countries where we have more chances based on the existing political parties, but I will remain the forever optimist here, I think, but I never believe ever in giving up on anyone. I believe in changing hearts and minds, and I do believe that my numbers might not work, but that when you actually talk, and it takes a lot of convincing, and obviously it's not the best electoral strategy for this time, but so I was doing a tour of the north of France, so we in France starting regional tours to go meet people, stakeholders, and I was in Calais and Dunkerque, so we met not only with refugees and migrants, but with, you know, NGOs, and then we did a meetup, so basically we opened a Facebook event and people joined us. And as always, there were people that were pro-European, you know, very happy about the vote message, and there were people that really were not so happy about our message at first. And so we actually started to engage in a discussion. You know, why do you think that migration is such a bad thing? And in a town like Calais, it's not the easiest discussion to have in the first place when you've had, you know, migrant camps. Well, now you can't even call them camps because the police disperse them every 48 hours, but for the last 20 years. And I'm not going to pretend that I can change every heart and mind, but I definitely will try, and that's why I'm doing this in the first place. When we talked about them, about, you know, it's true that it's unfair for Calais to have to deal with this on its own for 20 years without enough funding, when already industries closed and people are unemployed. It's not the right way forward, and we're not dealing with solidarity. I agree. And those people were not friendly. So one of them wasn't very friendly towards migrants or refugees in the first place. So I wasn't going to inspire a big, you know, love affair with migration. But by speaking about it in concrete terms, showing the practical solutions that we could bring. So, for example, a new refugee system doesn't only benefit, you know, Spain, Italy, and Greece. If you talk about it, we have a resettlement system also for people in northern France that have been here for 20 years, are trying to pass in inhuman conditions, are living in inhuman conditions, and are trying to pass to the UK. So when you talk in concrete terms about what the EU can actually do for those people, I don't need them to, you know, suddenly change their minds, not be racist anymore, and fall in love with the idea of migration. What I hope that I will be able to do is convince them that dealing with it in a fair manner would also be a benefit to them, and that for this reason they shouldn't turn to the extremes in the first place. Obviously, we won't, and I'll finish on this. I'm not pretending, you know, we're going to get the majority in the parliament or anything, but I do believe that on the long term, our aim shouldn't just be to do the bare minimum and to convince people that are, you know, prone to our message, but should be to actually try to change the minds and the hearts of people that are way more pessimistic about those issues, and that could make the difference on the long term towards a society where we go. I do believe migration is the test. So, you know, whether we manage to deal with it and we have a more fair, more just, and a more responsible Europe, or whether we actually get destroyed by the whole thing.
May I mediate between those two for a second? Because poor Yanis, he just tried to, I mean, you have to get votes, you know what I mean? And it's horrible out there. I mean, any of you have to campaign. I mean, in my country, campaigning is, I mean, journalists and all that, they just talk about politicians. They don't realise every day you have to be, and in our country, you're on the doorstep, meaning you're knocking on actual doors in multiple occupancy flats. People poke their head out the window and say things to you, and they don't want to open the door, particularly these days. You know, nobody wants to open the physical door. You know, this is campaigning today. Getting votes is a very hard business in some elections. So this is really hard. You know, it's very hard. So there has to be a system. So I just want to say about Yanis here, you have to have a strategy and a system. But just to say to Colombe about how winning hearts and minds, you never know who is susceptible to good messages and who is going to be racist and who isn't racist. And I really like, if you don't mind saying about this thing about Calais, like some of the people who actually went there, some of the people who are affected by it, you can never generalize about people because you can win a lot of people over. And it's not a generational thing. It's amazing how many people can change their attitudes. And also it's a very visceral thing. Racism is a complicated thing sometimes. People who are used to living with neighbours and friends who are you know, not like them suddenly can change. Sometimes it's fear of the other because they're not even living near them, or they're separated, different schools or whatever. So I just think it's something that you don't give up on. I do agree, and I think people should remember this. You know, and you should aim for more diverse societies and diverse places, because that's one of the biggest problems. If you're not meeting anyone of you know, of another background, not saying anything about Brussels, you come to the European Parliament or the institutions. I mean, they're the whitest places on earth. So I'm just giving you an example. Okay, that's the reality. But this is one of the things that breaks down barriers. It really is, and this is one of the things that creates racism too. If there's no diversity or contact, I would say.
So I would like to pass the floor now to Miss Christina first, and then to the second row.
Names from 3 different countries. I was a migrant myself in Tunisia, and I was a refugee myself in my own country, in Spain, when I have to run away from the revolution. So I know something about that. I know a lot about racism, being married to an Arab and having a half Arab daughter. I'm a colleague of yours. I work at the European Parliament. I am a civil servant, and I campaigned for Europe since '86. I was very young. I am part of Alliance for Europe, and I am part of We Europeans campaign, and I have very good news for all of you tonight. So I'm bringing some positivism here, and I'm happy to speak out. The We Europeans campaign has reached 40 million people all over Europe for the last month. We have a presentation of the results this Friday in the European Parliament. Those who have no register cannot come because it's fully booked. We have 2,000 requests for 700 people only, but you can follow on the television, you can follow on the internet. What I have to say, the good news, is that the 10 topics that the European citizens raised as main, out of 10, there were 4 for the environment and none for security or migration. So it's not really true that we have, that Europeans are racist or that Europeans are against so many people. To counter-face, let's say, racism, I have some little ideas. For example, to Mr. Salvini, I would like to say that Italians were migrants all over the world. What are you talking about? To Mr. Trump, I would say, but your wife was a migrant. Your family were also migrants some time ago. And to all of us, I'd like to say that we are all foreigners somewhere. It's just a question of attitude. It's just a question of place. So I think that, for the results of this campaign, we are very positive because there's many positive Europeans. There's many Europeans that do not want to be pessimistic about all that. And many Europeans that in the end, what they want is that Europe stick to their values. And I don't think we're going to give up about that. So I have no question. I just wanted to intervene, and I hope I didn't bother you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your points. So I would like to pass the question now to the second row.
Hello.
You can take the microphone there.
Thanks a lot. Giorgio Carotti. I'm working in DG Research in the Commission, and I'm a polymigrant, having lived in 5 European countries, or stayed in Europe. One point, Cologne, for you. The example of Riace is great, because the first thing Salvini did when he became a minister for internal, he fired the mayor who did these fantastic things in Riace, because he found that one of the 1,500 migrants was there for illegal reasons. Based on that, he fired him, he closed the camp, and the 100 and 500 migrants which were there were bussed away across Italy with no legal place to stay. So basically they are now in the streets, and the Minister of Interior is possibly contributing to some criminality and certainly not safety in Italy. Salvini is creating the problem, because without the problem he is no one. Okay, the question. I'm in DG Research. I'm working on medical technologies, and we're working with Yanis, who is in health. And I was part of the task force who addressed the crisis in 2015. Now, the Red Cross told us that 50% of their work was not medical help. It was to reconcile families. Because the first thing the people who organize migration do, they break up families, because men are much easier, when you migrate by foot, it's much easier to pass the border with men. Then the women and the kids stay back, then the men try to get a refugee in one country, and then they bring the wife and the kids back. Except they take away the SIM card, because then they are weak, the person without a SIM card, because it's very easy to manage it. And then the Red Cross is trying to reconcile these families. So the question to you is, how can technology help in migration? One proposal we made as DG Research is to give every migrant a blue card, not a green card. It's a blue chip where they have 2 things: their data, who they are, and their vaccination. What was happening in the crisis? The kids get out from Syria. They arrive in Turkey. They are at the border. First thing they do, small kid, is your kid vaccinated? The woman doesn't know, etc., etc. Let's give him a jab. They move, they go to Greece or they go to another country. What do you do? Is the kid vaccinated? I don't know. Revaccination. They get to Germany, revaccination. That is bloody risky. And definitely not an overpass, but over-vaccinating is risky. So with that card, it would have been possible first to give a token to the migrants. I have something. I have my identity card. Okay? The proposal was voted down by the Commission because a particular country, your country, was saying,
well, I mean,
private liberty.
Idea,
no, it's not your responsibility, but private liberties, civil rights. You are going to track this migrant. We have to leave them free. This is the same country which has CCTV all over the place, and CCTV is good at one thing, not to distinguish between a white and a white, but definitely to distinguish between a wife, between me and you, or between you and me. That a CCTV will do very easily. Question to you, have you addressed the technology element? If not, we have plenty of arguments that you can use in the campaign, how this could reassure people. People want to know it is managed. Most of the people who have fear of migration, they fear it's not managed, the invasion, the great replacement of these bloody terrorists. If they fear it is managed, the people have an idea that when they get there, we know who it is, we know he is vaccinated, he is not a criminal, he is not a terrorist. Can it help?
That's quite a thorny one. If I can take responsibility, I bet you don't want to deal with this one. The way that you're, is this still working? Yeah, the way that you're unfortunately describing it is a bit edgy. The thing about, yeah, I mean, anything that my country rejects on migration is bound to have some merit, particularly on migration. We reject everything. Britain opts out of everything on migration, so there's nothing unique there. But on the question of technology, I mean, the stuff you said about SIM cards and how migrants are first of all disabled refugees in tracking in the smuggling routes and so on is correct. I mean, this is a lifeline, having the phone, having the SIM and everything. This is absolutely true. I've seen it myself. So the issue about tracking and management, there's something in what you say. There is something in what you say. The way the far right and this mass group of people who are now pursuing this issue of control, being out of control of this mass invasion of non-white people who are coming from Africa. This is the narrative that's going on in people's minds. What Yanis is talking about, the people who will always feel this way. Well, there's a mass of people who are feeling this way. The tabloids and the journalists know it. They play on it. Murdoch and the rest. They actually even portray it in imagery. You see it with the kind of lines of refugees, the Great Replacement, and there's no Farage. And so you understand that this is a very potent and very destructive thing. The issue about managing it, though, is complicated because on the other side there is the question of you're dealing with human beings. So the issue of tracking people and the issue, I mean, you can imagine is a genuine concern, and it's not an illegitimate concern. The concern coming from countries who don't want to do anything on migration is different, and my country is an example of that. So maybe that's not the best example. The best discussion is of those countries who want to do something but need to think about whether this is a tracking thing or whether it's really helping. The best way to pursue this is to talk about family unity, to talk about children. And I think this aspect will emerge very strongly because, I mean, I remember my father was removed from our family with wrong immigration status in the UK. We were also separated in Yemen. We were removed from my father. We were divided. So I've experienced family division in the immigration system, and it is the worst thing that can happen. It is really the most vicious thing that can happen to a family, particularly for younger children. Never forget it. So obviously, if this is happening during a refugee crisis, of course, these are very potent things. So for the refugees, immigrants themselves, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, that they have to stay alive and healthy. So vaccinations, of course. The only issue, of course, is if people start to see these people as kind of a managed group of people, then of course you cross a different line. But I would just say, I know you're speaking about it with passion, so for the right reasons. So of course those good aspects should be thought about, but of course we have to be really careful how you phrase such things, because you're talking about human beings, families, and so on. So for the good reasons, yes, but you have to be careful about the idea of tracking and so on. And don't use the UK again as an example. They are against everything on migration. They are the opting out country of the world, so please use another example. Yeah, and CCTV, I mean, honestly, the CCTV country of the world, I mean, only against China, you know. In fact, China's trying to keep up with the United Kingdom and CCTV.
Thank you very much for your questions and answers. So I would like to give the floor now to the first row on the left.
Hello, thank you. I am Ronald from Bolivia. So I have a comment and a question. So my first comment was about the races, because you said that people are racist towards white, but in fact in Latin America we're also racist against European people. The only thing is that there is a more like a positive discrimination. People like them better, they get up to higher positions in job in companies, or people treat them better as a restaurant, so they never complain about this. Yeah, I like this country, people treat me well. They never say, no, people are being racist against me, they treat me too well. No, because it's positive. And to change the tone, we in Bolivia as well, we are racist against our black population that came from Africa. Why? Because they have different customs. They have kind of African customs, and in our case we are more like indigenous and Christian. So we just don't hang out each other. We behave in different ways. So we never mix each other. A proof of that is in the government there is almost no black people. In TV there is almost no black people. And yeah. And to be even more extreme, in Chile, they are killing their Mapuche population, their native population. Why? Because they don't like them. They prefer, maybe they're expensive. I don't know. So just to give an idea that people are racist for reasons. And my actual question is, with Greeks suffering in economical position, Polish people having half the salary of their western part, Spanish youth, I think 1/4 people is unemployed for people below 30 years. People losing their jobs due to automation, artificial intelligence, removing the part of his high skill jobs which contribute a good amount of taxes. How do you justify to normal people, like you will give them jobs, you will spend money in language courses, integration courses, when they contribute the same as normal people, talking about low skill jobs? We need them for paying like the retirement funds. We desperately need that to pay that welfare state, or what? Thank you.
Just want to jump in quickly and say I hope I didn't give the impression that there was no racism in the rest of the world. I mean, my country of origin has a caste system which can compete with the most vicious racist setup. My wife's a Hindu. I can say this with real conviction, that the caste system into which you're born. I'm an Indian Christian, but with a Hindu middle name. It's a long story, St. Thomas Christian. So I'm actually born into a caste. You know, there can be no more discrimination than you see in the caste system. So I was not saying there's no racism. I mean, the racism of Latin America is something to behold. You know, it's quite a wonderful thing. You know, Argentina, and that was the great replacement of the 1920s. It's everywhere, yeah. No, we get that. Can I just make the point? Shoo. Yeah. Well, yeah. I think what we were talking about was the European Union, though. That's why we were here. So I was just trying to. I think we were explaining what the racist dynamic was for the European Union, I guess, and Europe. But I don't think we're denying there's racism all over the world. But one thing I would say is we had a debate. I mean, can I just say one great leveler? I don't know if there's anyone of African origin here, but we had the first ever, which is pretty disgraceful, the first ever debate last week, which I had to do the motion for, which was the first debate on Afrophobia in the European Parliament. It's the first time it's ever been discussed on the floor of the European Parliament since 1979. So I think one great leveler is people of African origin are pretty much the most underrepresented and most discriminated against group that you could probably get in Europe or anywhere around the world, and that's probably without any kind of discussion, and that's certainly a huge dynamic that we're going to see more of in the coming years. So I think that's probably without discussion, and I think you mentioned it as well. And Cecile Kyenge, practically the only African origin MEP, introduced the debate. And if anyone knows her career and the daily abuse she receives in Italy, being compared to a monkey and all the rest of it, this is a consultant ophthalmic doctor. And I was in the IOM camps with her, and people flocked to her. And the first thing she did is she asked for the medical tent and promptly started treating people with cataracts. And this is probably one of the most well-qualified, accomplished individual, no disrespect to any of their MEPs, I'm sure they're all very well qualified, but rarely do you see such a well-qualified MEP, and I've never seen such an abused member of the European Parliament in all the time in my 20 years. So this is probably a great leveler. So thank you for your contribution, but let's settle on that one. I think we can all agree people of African origin in Europe are not doing brilliantly. I mentioned Windrush as well in the United Kingdom. People are not really grateful for African origin immigration, as we can see.
So now I would like to pass the questions to the second last row and then to the fourth row on the left. And who else would like to make a question or a point?
I don't know if it works. Does it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we went quite far away from the point I wanted to make, because I wanted to speak more, make a contribution to this first speech of Mr. Moraes. It's not really a question, it's just trying to explain many things for some people who might not be aware of Eastern Europe, because you mentioned the beautiful country of Estonia, where I come from.
No, I'm talking about the Baltics. Oh, you're not Estonian. Are you Estonian?
I am Estonian Russian.
Okay.
Which just makes it even more interesting.
I know about Russian-speaking minorities. Don't lecture me about Russian-speaking minorities. I know about it. Please don't. Are you going to do that?
No, I'm not going to do about that.
Okay,
no,
I know all of them because I've kind of inadvertently not offended.
No, I wanted
mentioned.
to talk about migrants mostly, not about Russian minorities.
No, I know it's the Baltics. Okay, I wasn't saying it's Eastern Europe.
No. Fine.
Okay.
No, but also I want to talk about Poland and Hungary as well, so let's say Eastern Europe.
Okay, knock yourself out. I'll be silent.
No, myself. Well, basically, as you said, Estonia, it would be unfair if a migrant comes and we say to them, okay, you have to go to Estonia. I mean, that's unfair because these people never heard about this country before, so why would they go there, So when they come, most of them, let's be honest, even in France, people don't know where Estonia is. I experienced that myself. So when they come, obviously, we received a huge amount of 200 people, and we were really, really impressed with that, and most of them left. Most of them left to Germany, anyways. So, but now we have about 19% who had elections last week, 2 weeks ago, and the 19% got the populist party, we call populist, far right. But, they're different because they say we don't want just migrants, we just don't want any other culture, any other nationality in our country, because we have, as you know, minority of Russians and Slavs from the Soviet Union. 30% of all the population are not Estonians. And I think it's not the case anywhere in Europe where it's such a big amount of not native. So that's why Estonians are really concerned, and they don't want to have any other else. And they even want to get rid of Russians, and they don't want to accept anyone. But what about Hungary and also Poland? As you know, it was the Iron Curtain or Eastern Bloc, and these people, mostly those who don't accept the migrants, they are born in the Eastern Bloc. They believe all their conscious life there. And now I think they've seen mostly black people on the TV, maybe somewhere, and that's how they interacted with them. And now if they come, it's something new for them, and maybe that's why they're scared, because young people, they travel, they don't do that. Young people protest against the policies of Orban or policies of the Polish government. But the old people are more conservative, and actually they get the power. So that was my contribution. Maybe you have comments, but
yeah. May I just really briefly say, it's a good contribution because when I did the first minorities report in 2004 from a very kind of Western European perspective, and I had to rewrite the whole thing because Russian-speaking minorities language minorities, linguistic minorities. You see it in Hungary and other countries. And of course, your example, it makes things more complicated as to how people perceive their country, their small populations as well. So the dominance of what is going on. But the issue, and then the issue of migrants do come, they don't like it, they leave, all these issues. This is what I was trying to say in a sensitive way, that countries need to get used to what is going on. People have good hearts everywhere, as Colin was saying. You have to try not give up on people, and the colleague who was speaking about, being in I think you're saying in a mixed relationship as well. This is the test, you have to get past all these different situations and see that human beings all over the place are the same, but in circumstances they can react badly because, and I want to make this point about technology, because what has changed since I grew up in the 1970s in Scotland and Yemen and India to today is technology. So if Orban wants to scare the shit out of people in a country with no immigrants, all he has to do is say, look, switch on the TV, see these hordes of people, these people that look like this, they're coming here because you're in the European Union, or, he can be anti-Semitic, or all the tropes are much clearer because he has the internet, you have visuals. And I think a lot of that was did not exist in that way. Things were more distant. Technology is a massive, massive change. It's a material change. It's a real shift in how leadership can fail, and of course leadership can win too. We see Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, for example, how you can do the right thing. She's used technology to send the right messages in a very short space of time. I mean, unfortunately, we've only got one of her, and we've got like one massive Trump, So unfortunately, there's just not enough of her. But you see the point. Technology, you can get the images of people coming across the Mediterranean to downtown Tallinn and scare people, but really it's just Russian minorities. But this is a factor. People have to understand all of that. But you still have to make incremental changes. So it might be good to have resettlement in Estonia. Why not? Why not try? Why not? That's all I would say. Estonia is a pretty cool country. It's a bit like Finland, so don't talk yourself down. Look, if I was a refugee today, I wouldn't pick Latvia and Lithuania. I'd go for Estonia. Just my tip. You have to break taboos as well, and I just think that's European Union maybe has to do it sensitively, but it's got to. I just think something should happen like that.
So I'll use this because I've been wanting to jump back on the technology proposal. So I'll use this to jump back super quickly since you mentioned technology. So I haven't seen your blue card proposal, and I would love to look at it. And I agree with what Mr. Morales said about the dangers. I mean, the fact that we do need to consider the dangers of technology. So when I was working on refugee rights, the organization for which I did asked me to do some research on tech and how to improve not only, so it was an organization for displaced people, not only migration movements, but also how we actually process asylum claims and how to make it more efficient on the NGO side for it to be less costly. So I don't want to stay too long on the blue card because I agree with what was said on the panel, but I do think that there's some really, there's some real dangers. So I looked at some of the cases in a Kenyan camp. I can't remember the exact name of the technology, but where the iris was used to be able to access food and so on. And we saw that it was used quite often in a discriminatory manner, where one person in the family had access or whose iris was actually registered, and this person could get the food and not other people. And then we talked about blockchain and how to store refugees' informations and migrants' informations in different systems so that it would be more secured, and the fact that these identities wouldn't be lost and so on. And we also saw that blockchain is also prone to some security risks, and that it could. So I tend to think in case of worst case scenarios, I'm optimist, but I also always think of the worst case scenario. I mean, imagine if all of this information fell into the wrong hands. So I agree that the UK is probably not the best example in terms of, coming with the best willingness when we come to migration, but I do think there's some extremely serious risks in using certain methods to register, and that can actually be used to track people and for evil means on the long term. However, I do think that there's also some less risky technologies that we can use once people are already in our countries. So, you know, we talked about at the beginning of the panel about harmonizing systems and making them more fair. So, for example, by speeding up asylum processes without them being unfair, like was done in France by leaving a very short asylum, a very short appeal period, which meant that many asylum seekers couldn't actually appeal the decision. So in the US, there's this private company that started a chatbot and that actually enabled lots of migrants, not refugees, to get visas to the US, including people that were already in the US in illegal situations. So it saved costs on the NGO side and on the state sides, because all of the first steps were already done by a chatbot. That keeps on getting better. So there's lots of technologies I do think that can be used to better our systems, and we can learn from private companies that have already used it in certain scenarios, but I do think we have to be extremely careful, especially in thinking of worst case scenarios at the European level if we started tracking every single person that came in.
If I...
Sorry, just about, you said in Estonia there is 30% of stranger. Well, in Luxembourg, it's 47.9%.
Yes, Luxembourg.
In Luxembourg, and so there are, and it's there. There's no far right, I think, in Luxembourg. So, and it's a small country, but there are lots of strangers. So I think with a lot of Portuguese who speak Portuguese, and so
but it's Luxembourg.
Welcome strangers.
If I may answer to Christina's point about her good news that security was not one of the top 10 issues of the event that was polled. I also had a recent look to Eurobarometer studies indicating that climate change, employment, growth, these kind of issues are now on the top of the agenda of European people. Indeed, however, immigration or fears of immigration seems to be a little bit higher on the agenda of southern people for obvious reasons, especially in Italy, Greece, due to facts but also due to perception. So maybe to add from a campaigning point of view, civil society, we also need to be careful to make a study of our local population in our nations. What are the particularities in Hungary, Sweden, Greece, France, before we campaign about those issues? In the north of Europe, climate change, growth, artificial intelligence are by far much more important, the future of employment, much more important than immigration or security. So when we campaign there about more Europe or about what we perceive as European values, this is something we need to keep in mind. Europe altogether is not a unified place. There are a lot of variations within Europe. If I had more time, I would even argue that there are even more variations of racism, different types of racism per country, even per region. But maybe this is a topic for another discussion.
Thank you very much. So we can take now a couple of more questions. So first I will go with the fourth row on the left. And who else would like to make a question? So then we can go to the right. And maybe we can briefly conclude. Yes.
Okay. So I'm Rossella. Good evening. Thank you all for this is a very interesting and lively discussion. So I wanted to go back to the introduction actually of Mr. Karamitzius and to what he said about the distinction between refugees and immigrants. And I would like to say that in some countries, especially southern countries like Italy, where I come from, and we spoke about it widely, but in those countries this distinction is blurred because many people arrive and they're mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, so we experience a different kind of migration than, for example, Germany. And they apply for asylum because they know that that's the only way they can remain without a visa, without permission. Despite, unfortunately, I say, in my view, they don't have, they are not qualified or entitled to that right. But since the legal system in Italy is overburdened, it takes 2 years and sometimes even more to settle an asylum application. So in these 2 years, people remain in Italy. Fortunately, there was a good integration system, which was called SPRAR, or it exists still, but Mr. Salvini has undermined that. And I've worked in SPRAR, and I know that it worked very well. But after SPRAR, when people are denied their right to asylum, then they should go back. But in the majority of cases, that doesn't happen. And so that's what the people in Italy experience. People that apply for asylum despite people perceive they don't have the right to get asylum. So again, there is a great, there are great differences among member states, as you were saying, with relation to asylum and migration. And secondly, I wanted to come to the point of the resources. You said that we should use more resources to let people integrate and make people integrate. But I think that the European Union, and then Mr. Moraes will definitely be able to say something more about this. The European Union is already investing a lot of money in control, in migration management, especially in the African continent. And that's something that's not discussed very much, I would say, at least, for example, in Italy, among the public opinion. So what we are doing in the African continent, who are we giving this money to, and what this money used for, what are the effects on the continent, what are the effects on Europe? We absolutely know nothing about this. There's low public scrutiny, low accountability. So, and I agree with Mr. Moraes when he says there are migration management systems very racist, and I think that also the way in which we use our money is also racist because it's targeted at certain countries, and what we're trying to do is keeping the people there and not letting them come and emigrate. So, thank you.
And so who else would like to make a question? So we can go to this question and then finally to the third row.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone for being here. It's being a really interesting event. I'm Alejandra and I'm 20 years old, and it's more a suggestion and kind of a reflection because in this discussion I feel like we've missed the point of integration of the immigrants and the refugees that arrived to Europe. And one of my biggest concerns, and representing a European citizen and the youth of Europe, is that I'm seeing a lot of people of my age and my brother's age, who's 18, who are gonna vote this time, maybe also for the first time. And they're being obviously influenced by these populist parties, and they're instilling this fear towards the immigrant. And myself, I haven't seen any or a lot of European projects which are focused in enhancing understanding and connection between these refugees that arrive and nationals. So I think that if we want also to focus on how to stop racism or how to enhance understanding, this is one of the things that the European Union should focus the most. And I think it should focus the most on the youth, because we're the ones who are going to vote and we're going to be the future in the European Union. And I don't see any projects who are focused in, you know, meet people who have arrived, meet their cultures. And I consider myself a very open-minded person, but I see a lot of people around myself who are not. And I'm very worried because I see friends of my brother who are 18 and don't really care about politics and are just going to vote for the party who looks the coolest and maybe undermines the needs of these migrants. So it's more like a suggestion that civil society organizations as well should make this effort, maybe in your campaigning, also trying to bring together these two different types of people. And to members of the European Parliament, I feel that this should be an effort that should be taken, and I don't know if it's being taken in any ways. So it was just a reflection.
Thank you very much for adding that suggestion, because I initially asked a question about how to tackle down racism. So yeah, thank you for addressing that point, and I do agree. So now to conclude, I would like to pass the question to first the third row, and then to the last row as well as yeah, the second.
Thank you. We talked before about the fact that Eastern European countries refuse to accept migrants, but in the case, for example, of Poland, I heard that they replied to these accusations by explaining that since the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, the Ukrainian conflict with Russia, they accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees, of migrants from their country, which were not accepted by Western European countries. Is this affirmation true, or is it not? Thank you. Thank you.
Then first we can go to the second row to make it a bit easier, and then we can go to the last one. And afterwards we need to close.
Thank you very much. I want to come back to the suggestions you made, like reforming the Dublin system. And I know that in international law, what happens a lot is that they don't open debates in fear of worse outcomes than the treaties that are existent. And do you think that is also possible in future migration discussions and a new Dublin reform? Because as we have seen here, there's a lot of discussion. There are a lot of far-right parties all over Europe that are growing more and more power, getting more and more power. So, do you think that could be a risk of opening a discussion about the reform?
Last question.
And now we can go to the last question, and we will answer all questions together.
Going to change something, but I prefer just to make double check from the information you just said it, is that the Syrians started the immigrants in 2015, which is totally is not true, because it started between Iraq and Syria, which is called by ISS, if people know what's mean ISS, Islamic State, Iraq and Syria. And after that, the migration of Syrian and Syrian, Iraqi, Afghani, whatever, started at that time, and it was the maximum of 2015. He said 1,200,000 person. This is also not correct, because only Germany received 1,000,000 person. Only Germany. And you have Belgium, you have Finland, which received more than 500,000. So the numbers, I'm not sure about it. For the mister in the first line who said about some man leaving his parents in the country and coming here and then after reunion with his family, I just have one question. What will be your feeling as a father leaving your kids in a boat with the maximum size is 40 and in the boat there are 66 with kids and they may die or whatever. So I think this was one of the bravest things that men did or at that time. And for the girl that was there, she asked, yes, the European, they did a project which is called Refugee Got Talent. It was here in Belgium, in Brussels, and they did so many activities with the refugees, which is like drawing, painting, singing, and many activities. And it was like, they did speeches. I have one of my friends, he did speeches in European Parliament, and so they did many things for the refugees as an activity or project with the European Parliament.
Thank you very much for all your questions, and now we will answer the questions. So I'll give the floor to the main speakers.
Answering to the issue of Italy, where it takes 2 and more years to process an asylum. Of course, I suspect, I cannot prove it, that there might be political reasons for this obstructionism. But also, even if the government of Italy or Greece had the best intentions, this is why we campaign for reviewing the Dublin system. This is why we campaign for a common European asylum policy. If we had a common European asylum policy, better organized, more centralized, and more rationalized, definitely will not take 2 years for these people to get their status cleared. And I agree with you that in many cases like this, the notion of immigrant or refugee or simply illegal person is blurred. But again, this is created due to the lack of the right framework and the lack of the right political will. Answering to the issue of 2015 and Syria, the figure that I mentioned, 1.2 million people, my source is the official figures of Eurostat. You can argue that they were more or even less, but it doesn't really change the fact that it was the peak, that in 2015, indeed, we had for the first time the sense of crisis, because that figure for the first time was not manageable. Of course, we had refugees from Syria since 2011, and of course, we had refugees from Sudan in the 90s and Algeria, and we had refugees from Afghanistan since the 80s. But 2015, I think, has been identified as the year of crisis, even if Colomb crisis claims it is not a crisis, it was something created because of our political inability to deal with it. No matter how we call it, that year was really a benchmark in the European immigration policies. Answering to the question about Poland, I will give a quite anecdotal answer because my wife is Polish, so I feel a bit familiar to the country. In Poland has a particular connection with Ukraine. Second or third generation of Polish, the family of my family are Polish refugees from Ukraine since the Second World War. So they treat Ukrainians with a kind of affinity. Of course, there is a kind of local kind of discrimination with the Polish, the Ukrainians, but in any case, for the Polish, Ukrainians are much more welcome than Africans or Asians for obvious reasons of cultural affinity. I'm not sure whether Ukrainians could not move further to Europe. There are many Ukrainians all over Europe, in the UK, in France, here in Belgium I have met many. It might be used as a cheap excuse. Finally, answering to the issue of education and projects, yes, the EU is running some projects in this respect, but let's not forget that the EU budget is only 1% of the total GDP of Europe. What we really need is commitment of national programs, national resources. The big money and the big possibility to infiltrate into children's mind is in the hands of the national member states. They have the responsibility on education. They have the school curricula. The real work can be done there. Of course, we can finance here from Brussels some projects, but it's too little to have a really meaningful effect. I think everything should start from the national budgets and school curricula to change the attitudes of children with regards to solidarity, anti-racism, anti-xenophobia.
Thank you very much. So now so I will pass the floor to Ms. Colomb.
So I'll stay brief because I'm imagining that everyone is quite hungry at this time of the night and won't go into every detail. I think what we have seen in this discussion, you know, we can talk of refugees, we can talk of migrants, we can talk of who's applying for what status. I think the bottom line is if someone has to apply for a refugee status coming to Italy in human conditions, it's because we have a problem that we need to deal with. So regardless, I think my bottom point is we just need to think and to go back to the basis of we're talking about human beings that are often, if you choose to go to Europe in such horrible conditions as the one we're talking about, don't have much of a choice for a better life, to survive. We talked about, you know, people choosing to leave their children behind because they knew that they had too much of a risk to die in a boat. And so that for me, at least, our responsibility during this campaign, going back to the campaign topic, is to make sure that we bring this topic back to what it really is. It's about saving human lives, enabling people to live in dignity, and doing this together. And I really hope that the message we can actually pass, whoever you know, voting for or whoever you're campaigning with, whether it's civil society, whether it's a political party or other, we can actually go back to the basis, which is we have seen we can't deal with it individually. You know, Italy, France, any country we have seen it doesn't work. We need to deal with it together. I agree there's always a risk of the solution being worse off, but I don't think we can shy away from a discussion because, I mean, the effects are already disastrous. 6 people are dying a day, as was said. For me, obviously it can always be worse, but we don't have a choice but to try to act. And I would encourage all of you to try to act now. As we said, those elections are very decisive. What will you tell your children? Act now and make sure that you don't actually have to see the disastrous effects of the next parliament, and that we can go towards a better solution, towards people living in fair and safe conditions.
Just the person asked about Dublin. So I'm really worried that because they've frozen Dublin and all the asylum package, the next parliament is going to be more to the right. I'm not saying that as a value judgment. I'm just saying it's just a fact. And the worry is that that they'll literally make something more returns focused. I can't see them reviving Cecilia Wickstrom's Dublin proposal. I just don't see it. And it's connected to qualifications, reception conditions. So I think you were right, which is you open the discussion and it's going to be a different discussion. They're not going to want all of this stuff, and they're going to break off any things like any of the parts that they're already breaking off, which we're going to do before the end of the mandate. So my real fear is this, and it's driven by the member states. So they'll drive and push the Commission into what they want, but it depends what the Commission is like then. It depends. I mean, the Parliament is going to mirror a lot of these crazy member states when they get their hands on it. So unfortunately, it's not a good story. On the integration thing, I could not agree more with Yanis. Integration is in the hands of member states. And when I was your age, all the right-wing messages were like a joke. The right-wing people were very uncool, and the left was very cool. This is a long time ago. Older people will remember everything about the left was cool. Che Guevara, the whole shit was cool. You know, I mean, young people don't even know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, because of the right and the stuff we see now, I mean, even my son has mentioned some of this. It's quite appealing what these people are doing, you know. So I really get what you're saying, and I wish adults would not consult younger people. I don't see why you would vote in a European election at all. I don't see what your colleague friends would want to vote for unless they're getting very precise, targeted messaging. You know, so it really is a big issue. But member states have to do the heavy lifting on integration because the EU doesn't have many of these levers. And just the last thing about what the EU is doing in Africa. The EU is doing this thing in Africa, doing a lot of good work. It's evacuating people. There's a lot of good people helping with the IOM, UNHCR, so don't get this wrong. And I've seen all of the really excellent work, and if you're going to work in that, please do it. But it's also doing this thing with Frontex, which is hidden. Which is this kind of neo-colonial stop black people getting to the Mediterranean in the first place. And it's like something out of the 1960s, you know, it's something, it really is. And because, as Yanis said, we've got 1% of the budget of the GDP, we're not going to stop many people, are we, with that? So every time I go, I've been there, it's like these Frontex officers that pretend that they're not Frontex, you know, ignore me, I'm not really a security agent from Germany, you know, or something. So it's just all bull, you know, but they're there to stop Africans coming to Europe. But there's a lot of good people doing a lot of really amazing things in you know, Libya, evacuating and doing lots of good things. So please don't lose hope on a positive message. You know, honestly, the European Union, if it's not there, then everyone is going to regret it, because you have everyone fighting each other, Salvini's everywhere, chancellors everywhere, conflict everywhere, the worst of humanity. People should stay together, fight for a better European Union, a better result. It's definitely all there to fight for. And I'm British, okay, so I can be honest, because we're out, and it's a complete tragedy. European Union at its best is the best thing in the world. Honestly, it is, definitely.
Well, I would like to say one final message. I would like to thank you all first for attending tonight and using your personal time to come to this event. And also, I really do hope that the European elections can also change the laws for integration, and also integration not only for refugees but for many skilled migrants who wish to remain in the European Union and contribute to European society. So thank you very much for all the panelists as well who use their own time to come and give a speech.